very excited about our first question today to ask Megan about what she's drinking, because having known Megan for a while and certainly following her on Instagram and Twitter and things like that, like seeing the cocktails that have graced her her bar has been very impressive. So, and I'm trying to bring my A game too, but I'm sure it's not going to be as as refined as yours. So
yeah,
great. I have a good feeling about the cocktail scene here tonight.
I don't do cocktails. Or drinking.
I'm
not helping.
Straight from the bottle. It's fun.
Yeah. I think we just got to teach you, and maybe that'll be my goal for the next month or so at Varsha, is just to teach you some very basic kind of cocktail skills, because I mean, I think there's something about using good bourbon, but not like super good bourbon, to mix and to create kind of different tastes and stuff like that. So
yeah, I don't want to judge anybody who likes this bottle, but I'm thinking of maybe learning how to make some Scotch cocktails, or maybe just drinking this bottle with Scotch and soda, because I dislike this bottle so much. I don't know why I bought it. It was underpriced at Trader Joe's, and so I was like, oh, this is like lower priced, because like usually it costs like $70-$80, and like I had Macallan 15 or 18 or whatever at a bar a couple years ago, and that was delicious. But obviously I didn't realize that the Macallan 12 is probably not as good as like the others. So I'm gonna make cocktails with this, because it tastes like watered down whiskey. And that's like the biggest insult to me. I'm so sorry, Macallan.
It tastes like whiskey with ice? Is that what you're saying, Varsha?
Yes! No, it doesn't even taste like whiskey with ice. It tastes like I put ice in my Scotch, left it out in the sun, and then drank it.
Oh.
And I'm being so mean. I'm so sorry to Macallan.
There goes our sponsorship.
Yeah,
yes,
exactly.
I'm so sorry.
Exactly. I will say though, we have a section of our kind of bar area that is just bourbon that is for mixing.
That's right.
And the other ones are kept separate. They're like they don't correspond or socialize with the mixable bourbons. But there's some really good bourbon cocktails out there, including the variation of what I'm drinking tonight.
Mm-hmm.
Nice.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that I think you learn relatively quickly is like you don't want to spend like $80 or $90 like on a bottle that you're going to mix, right? Because it's just like the price point. Like maybe somebody's rich enough to do that. I'm certainly not rich enough to do that. But also like the flavors don't really kind of work, and so you want kind of a lower end, a little bit stronger bourbon in a lot of cases. That can survive. If you're putting some vermouth or some other things in there as well. So.
Also, it's sort of like an insult. There was a horrible meme on Twitter, or maybe it was on TikTok, of this filthy rich dude. I don't even like Johnny Walker Blue Label anymore, but he was like mixing Johnny Walker Blue Label and Coke. And I was like, what are you doing, man? That is a $200 bottle of whiskey. Like,
Set it on fire.
I would rather set it on fire.
All right. Well, on that note, maybe if it's okay, I think we'll get going. We're not going to set anybody on fire or anything on fire. Hopefully, knock on wood. This episode
the night is not over yet, Matt. So
that's right. I mean, like the second half hour, my wife always calls drunk with historians.
Yeah.
And so, like,
I wrote a whole book about destruction. So
that's right.
It was sort of a lab experience. So
that's right. Your amazing book Ruination, which we were talking about earlier, is kind of the thread that connects all of us together in some ways. So at least brought us together, at least initially. So anyway, thank you everyone for joining us this Friday night for Drinking with Historians. Our guest tonight is the amazing and wonderful Megan Kate Nelson. You may know her from one of her most recent published book, I should say, The Three-Cornered War, which was a Pulitzer Prize finalist this past year. She has a new book on Yellowstone coming out, as well as a book on ruins after the Civil War called Ruination, which was the book we were referencing earlier. So we're going to talk about all sorts of stuff. Again, as I mentioned too, like her cocktail game is on point. So the first most important question has to be for you, Megan. What are you drinking?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on. Longtime viewer, first time guest. Tonight I am drinking in honor of the Southwest, because I imagine we're going to be talking a fair bit about that. I'm drinking a mezcal cocktail made with this single village mezcal, which is, if you like tequila and mezcal is very smoky, and Varsha may not want to hear this, but it is a good swap out for bourbon and whiskey in some cocktails because it has that smoke. It brings that smoke. So I am drinking tonight an El Oro, which is a version of the Gold Rush, which is actually a bourbon cocktail that has honey syrup and lemon. So it's 2 ounces mezcal, 1 ounce honey syrup, 1 ounce lemon, like fresh squeezed lemon juice. And it's in my fancy glass because you all are fancy. So I brought the fancy.
That's amazing. I love mezcal. It's like the better version of tequila. I also love tequila, but anytime I go to like a Mexican place and there's a bar, I will order a mezcal margarita. My favorite part was I went on a date a couple of weeks ago, and it was at a whiskey bar, and the dude ordered mezcal for his like second drink, and he like drinks. He's like, "That's too smoky," and I was like, "What?" It was very weird because then I tasted it, and I was like, "That's delicious, man!" Like, there's very few non-whiskey drinks that I can drink neat, and that's one of them. So
yeah, and this recipe is actually in the gin form. It's called the Bee's Knees.
Yep.
Wow.
And so you can like, and I have no doubt that vodka would be like crushable. You'd be on the floor before you knew what happened because it was so utterly drinkable. But I actually really like those cocktail recipes where you can just switch out the main spirit. It makes mixing very easy because then I know I have all of the ingredients that I need for like 4 different possible cocktails. Also, it's good for parties because some people, you know, like had bad experiences with tequila in college and will not drink it again. And so
it's like 50% of the population, right? Like, had a bad experience with tequila at some point in their life. So
you give them the gin version and they'll enjoy that. But yes, all my Southernist friends enjoy the Gold Rush, the sort of classic bourbon recipe.
Yep. Fantastic. So there's a great bar in New York City called Death & Co. And they have cocktail books. One of which you can buy kind of anywhere. One of which is called the Cocktail Codex, which is really great because it shows like family trees of drinks. And so exactly like you were saying, it shows like, here's a base, and then here's ways, if you have this liquor, you can do this with it. If you have that liquor, you can kind of do that with it. And it's a really nice introductory way to think about kind of creating cocktails. And it's very user friendly. So anyway, so Varsha, what are you drinking today?
I am, in honor of the fact that I'm going to be going to Kentucky for the first time ever in a couple of weeks to visit bourbon distilleries. I'm drinking the first ever bourbon I actually ever liked. This is my second bottle of it. It's the Willet Pot Still bourbon, and it's delicious. It's really smooth. It's a lot of vanilla. It's really good. This was like in 2017. I was trying to teach myself how to drink Scotch back then because I still wasn't good at it. So I'd be drinking Irish whiskey and Coke all the time. And then a friend of mine took me to a bar in DC where in the front of the bar, they serve chicken. In the back of the bar, it's bourbon. I think it's called Bourbon and Chicken or Chicken and Whiskey, the place in DC.
I think that's what it's called. Yeah.
Yes. And I am vegetarian. And so we go to the bar place and it's like a very fancy bar. So they don't have cocktails or anything. Or if they did, my friend was like, "No, you're drinking like neat bourbon today." And he ordered me this bourbon and I had to, save face and drink it. And it was really good. So that's why I bought the bottle.
That's fantastic. So Rachel, you seem to be coming to us today from the Garden of Eden. So what are you drinking there?
I am. Yes, it's my turn to broadcast from an undisclosed location. Yeah, that's right. So, but this will kind of give you a clue. I am drinking a Wallenpaupack Hefeweizen. So I am not at the Wallenpaupack Brewery, but I was earlier today.
Now you're going to have lots of people in the Q&A, like doing geotagging and stuff like that.
I'm not staying here. I'm staying like 26 miles away from here, so no one can actually find me.
Okay, good.
And I have 2 cell phones.
Yeah, I was gonna say this is why you have the burner phone. This is the real.
Right.
That's right. You're just gonna leave one there, and people are gonna track it, and they're gonna open it up, and then there's gonna like a bomb explode or something like that, right? Like, yeah. So that's a lot more exciting than my undisclosed location. So I decided to go with a cocktail as well, and mine is called a Hot Damn in a Barrel. which is I think it's kind of a local creation. This a chef who originally was from Roanoke, Virginia, which is kind of just up the road, and it's a variation on a Manhattan, except it uses rye instead of bourbon, and then Manhattan has sweet vermouth. It has some sweet vermouth, and then it has Ancho Reyes liquor, which is a really spicy kind of chili liqueur. So the rye and the ancho gives it a really nice spice, which was also, I was kind of inspired by the Southwest, so I was thinking that, but it's just kind of, it kind of hits you right in the face, in the face mouth, and it's delicious. So
nice.
I love it. So anyway, so thank you again for everybody for joining us. Please remember to put your questions for Dr. Nelson in the Q&A, and Rachel, who will fade into the background in just a moment here, will be monitoring them and sending them to us, and we'll get to them in the second half hour. So thank you, Rachel.
Thank you, Rachel. She's going to go off and do something nefarious, I think. I think there's very suspicious going on there.
Probably be a third phone, right? In a few minutes. So, like, who knows? Yeah. Anyway, all right. So thank you, everyone. And I'll give it to Varsha to ask our first question.
So I haven't had a chance to finish the Three-Cornered War yet. I just started it. But one thing that everybody should know, if you haven't read it, it's basically, it's a narrative history. It's not like most history books that have an intro, a conclusion, an argument, blah, blah, blah. It's not a typical academic history book. How did you decide to write about the Southwest through 9 individuals? How'd you come up with this idea?
So it's funny that you should have been talking about Game of Thrones before the episode, because I was thinking about this book and thinking about all the different stories and how I was going to bring them all together into one piece. And I knew that I wanted to experiment with narrative history. I had left academia by this time, so I was like, I don't need to conform to like any kind of academic structure, so I can just do what I want. Within reason, as long as it appeals to an editor. And I read a lot of literature. I was an interdisciplinary major undergrad in both history and literature. I'm an American Studies PhD. So I read a lot of fiction in my spare time. And then I also, so it was around the time when Game of Thrones came out, the first season. And so I watched it first and I was like, okay, this is interesting. And then spoiler alert, they killed off a main character. And I was like, what just happened? And so I was like, I need to go read the books. And I went and read the books and I was like, okay, these are like really terrible and awful and violent and rapey and like hideous. And yet I'm still reading. So what is compelling me? And as I often do when I read something I really like, I go back and I kind of map it out. And so I went in and I was like, he's doing multi-perspective narrative. Like which is a strategy that a lot of fiction writers use and have increasingly used. We see it in movies a lot also, where you're seeing events from different perspectives. And I was like, oh, like maybe I could interweave the stories in this sort of way. Because I already knew at that point that several of the protagonists in the book kind of cross paths. They knew each other in some cases, or they were sort of in the same places, kind of ran into each other more obliquely in that sense. And I was like, I'll just go ahead and try it and see if it works. Although, spoiler alert, no dragons in the Three-Cornered War, which was very upsetting. I was hoping to find,
huge bummer.
I was hoping to get some dragons in there. I was hoping to get some camels in there, and they didn't really. I mean, I think I have one reference, and they didn't make it in, which made me sad. But it was really, really fun. Initially, it was really hard because I was used to writing academically.
Yeah.
And so to kind of wrench myself out of that kind of tradition of writing and really start writing in this more narrative and richly detailed format, and then to get these people kind of in and out of each other's stories, was a huge challenge. I think I wrote part 1 over and restructured it probably 6 or 7 times by the time the book entered its final manuscript phase. But it was super fun. It was really fun to do.
I'm really interested what you said about how you read a lot of literature and also like wanting to break out of kind of a traditional kind of at least the perception of an academic kind of voice, you know, and writing for trade is very different. Writing for kind of a popular press, what most people think of as a popular press versus an academic press, like they're totally different worlds. So like, how do you see, and I think you kind of answered this, or how do you see like those two worlds of like overlapping, like a fictional voice, a narrative like you would see like in a novel versus kind of a writing for people who are still academic historians.
Right. Yeah. Well, and I'll be interested to know what you think of this too, because you have just finished a book too, right, with David, that's with a trade press. So it's first of all, I have never bought into the idea that the difference between academic writing and trade book writing is jargon. I actually don't think that's true at all. I think most academic writers don't use jargon, and most of them are really good writers. So for me, it's a matter of structure. Academic writing is argumentatively driven. We're kind of, academic writing is a little stuck in a structure that's kind of intro, thematic or chronological chapters, conclusion, right? And so the challenge of writing for a trade audience and trade editors is the story is the thing. The argument is still there. And that's actually the trickiest part, is I find it really easy to write the story, but then inserting the argument in specific places without sounding too academic-y or without kind of inserting myself as the scholar and the voice, that's a little trickier. That takes a little more kind of finessing. But again, that is really fun. And I should say, my editor actually, I wanted to just start the book with Baylor. I just wanted to drop you in like you were in a novel. And my editor was like, no. You cannot do that. Like you have to bring the reader in with a prologue so they know where they are and what you're about to talk about. Like you have to and she was always like, you do have to make the arguments. I mean, the story is the thing, and you have to have people who the reader will kind of latch onto and become invested in, because that's what keeps them turning pages, is they want to know what happened, right? That kind of drive is not present really in academic writing. In academic writing, you're like, what is this argument? How is it going to help me make my argument? And that's super useful. It's really useful to have that kind of research and that argumentation. But the demands of that trade kind of narrative writing, and also just kind of giving people very basic information that you wouldn't think you would need to do in an academic book. But in a trade book, it's a little bit akin to just teaching a survey, where you're like, I just need to give them like the very basics, like what is a greenback? Like what are these things? Like you have to sort of explain them because most people don't know. But I mean, was that your experience too, Matt, with?
It's funny. I mean, like I'm seeing exactly what you mean, and especially what you just said about kind of seeing it as teaching. I think some of the best chapters, at least as we've seen, we'll see what people think about it when the book's finally out. But some of the best chapters like came from lectures that like David or I had given in class, right? In which the framework of how you're explaining it to a bunch of kind of mildly interested 18 to 20-year-olds, right, is like that's how you're trying to explain it for a general audience, right? And then the other thing that I felt was very interesting is the balance between kind of argument and narrative, and how it kind of shifts in, kind of different audiences, because I think you can do both and lose the other, both ways, and kind of lose the other. And that's not really great in any way, shape, or form either. To bring it back to like Game of Thrones, right? Like Game of Thrones, one of the reasons it was criticized, the show, is for issues of sexposition. If you remember that term, right, where something sexual would be going on and then somebody would be talking over here to explain what was going on, right? And, the sex is happening, so you're still watching because there's this really boring, dumb monologue happening, which is explaining the plot kind of over here.
Yeah. Which is talking about like federal power. Like
that's right. Yeah. But there's like a brothel in the background, right?
Yeah.
So it's like you can't do that because that kind of sucks too. So but I think, I mean, one of the things I think that's great about your war, I mean, and maybe we need to back up and ask a kind of a more basic question, is like, in the three-cornered war, we need to know who the three corners are, right, for our audience. But, the idea of kind of telling this compelling narrative that kind of weaves itself into something that people kind of already know, like, the American Civil War, but explores like a really different, rich, understudied kind of area, I think is really fantastic. So kind of what led you, I guess my question there is like kind of what led you that way?
Yeah. So my current book projects always lead to my next project. Like, I don't know how anybody else feels about that, but because I think we all come to it in our own way. Like I know people who have like huge files of like 18 ideas, book ideas. And I'm like, I'm so profoundly jealous of those people because I have like 0 book ideas except the book I'm working on. And then usually what happens is during that process of research, I run into something else where I'm like, oh, that could be interesting. And I just sort of file it away kind of in my mind. And when I was doing Ruination, you know, that was my first jump into Civil War history. And actually, there was a book before that, the dissertation.
Trembled Earth.
Yeah, Trembling Earth, which is a cultural history of the Okefenokee Swamp in northern Florida, southern Georgia. I always feel bad for Trembling Earth. I'm always like, you're like the dutiful oldest child who like doesn't like it does okay, but is like not great, and like all the other children like totally outshine the elder, even though the elder is like doing the work. Like the elder's still in print. Like
it's because people don't appreciate environmental history enough. Like they all love Ruination because it starts with environmental history, but then it goes into other things that are more important. It's the audience's fault, Megan. It's not your fault.
It is. But at least, you know, the state parks in the Okefenokee region still stock the book. Like they buy like 2 books a year, and that keeps me like on the list, which is exciting.
Rolling in the tens of dollars of royalty fees.
Exactly. I get like 50 cents. And it's very sad. But when I was writing Trembling Earth, I ran into ruins in the swamp. And so I was like, oh, I could write a book on ruins. So that was the original idea, was ruins in the 19th century, which luckily I had written Trembling Earth. So I knew that was a terrible idea because it was too huge. Like, how am I going to do that? Like, that's crazy. Like financial ruin, sexual ruin, you know, military ruin. And so I just said, you know, what is the moment in American history that created the most destruction? And I was like, oh, the Civil War. Had I ever taken a class in Civil War history? No. Had I ever studied it in grad school? No. And I was just like, oh. And actually, I find that whenever I run into American Studies PhDs, and I don't know if anyone out there is an American Studies PhD, but we are prone to do these things. Like we are very susceptible to the bright, shiny new thing where we're like, ooh, I've never done that before. Why don't I go research that thing I've never studied at all that will necessitate this sort of ground up process. So I did, as we often do, just said, I'm going to learn this by teaching it. So I signed up to teach Civil War history classes. My poor students at Texas Tech and Cal State Fullerton, basically, they could have sued me for malpractice if they had. I mean, they would have been within their rights, and I would have settled. Like I would have been like, yes, you are correct. Like I was learning along with you. But so while I was writing Ruination and teaching these Civil War classes, I learned about these battles at Glorieta and Apache Canyon, which I was like, I have never heard of these before. I have not heard of the fact that Colorado soldiers were involved in these fights. And I grew up in Colorado. And so, you know, as you guys know, when you hit upon something like that, where you're like, how did I not know this? This like sparks all the historians sort of, I want to go study this because I had no idea this existed. And, you know, there had been a bunch of really good military histories written about the period. But as I researched more, I was like, you know, there is this 3-cornered war, right? There is the Union, the Confederacy, Native peoples, which predominantly in the region that I'm looking at, which is the Southwest, is Navajos or the Dene and Chiricahua Apaches. And I was like, that is a really interesting story because, you know, Ari Kelman's book, A Misplaced Massacre, had just come out, you know, and he was the first one to really contend, like the Civil War was an Indian war in the West, and looking at Sand Creek. And I was like, hot damn, he is right. Like,
he is right,
And so I started to really think about that and started thinking about building this narrative around all of these people from these very different communities who were they all had stakes in the Southwest, and they were all fighting for control over it. And then, you know, the 3-cornered war, that phrase was used by a soldier to describe the Union, the Confederacy, and Native people. But then it also kind of came as I wrote the book, it came to embody kind of the whole argument that the Civil War was about the North and the South, but also about the West. And that there were Anglo soldiers and Hispano soldiers and Native fighters involved in this. So it has the three-cornered war has three different possible meanings, which I liked just as a matter of
like literary awesomeness,
yes.
as the phrase goes. Yeah, that's not a real phrase. But so you were talking about how you named it three-cornered war, how people back then used the term. One of the terms that I remember the most when I was reading about Reconstruction for my comprehensive exams after I finished Ruination is Elliot West's book. I don't know if you've read that book, The Last Indian War. And so in that book, as well as in like a couple of articles, he includes this term. He created this term called Greater Reconstruction, right? This idea that Reconstruction is not just the reconstruction of the South, the traitorous South or the former Confederacy, but it's literally the reconstruction of the West as well as the whole country as a whole. Does that term sort of like find its way into either Ruination or the Three-Cornered War, right? This idea that after this war is over, we're going to have to rebuild the nation completely.
Right. I mean, it definitely does in Three-Cornered War. There's real attention. The time span of the book is actually 1861 to 1868, which is a longer and Civil War historians are talking about this a lot. Like whenever you expand geography, you expand chronology, or you mess with. If you mess with geography, you mess with chronology. This is a way that you see an event you think you know really well from a totally new vantage point in a bunch of different ways. And so much of the action of the Three-Cornered War in the last third of the book actually takes place after Appomattox. And so in the West, there was a celebration. The war was over 2 weeks after the fact because there was no railroad and there was no telegraph. So news traveled extremely slowly. And, then the death of Lincoln, again, like 2 to 3 weeks afterward. But in the West, that dividing line between what was Civil War and what was Reconstruction just didn't really exist as much. It was much fuzzier because the Civil War was an Indian War in the West by this point. It just continued. And so that was very interesting to me, how, we're just going to kind of move, Appomattox was an important moment, but the war continued in different ways in different places. And this is what we gain when we look at events like this from these new or unexpected kind of places or unexpected vantage points. But yeah, and Greater Reconstruction is also, that's a very important term and a very important argument for the new book on Yellowstone, which actually, okay, you guys are the first to hear this breaking news.
Spoilers!
I'm going to announce this on Drinking with Historians. The title has changed. Yes. I don't know, Matt, if you went through any title stuff, but titles are
There's a little bit of title stuff.
There's a little bit of title stuff.
A little bit of title stuff.
Yeah. And, I have never successfully actually taken a book project from it and kept its initial title through to publication. It has never happened. And most of the time I'm totally chill with that. That's not a hill I'm going to die on. I trust the marketing people, but in trade publishing, the title becomes really, really important. And so, we thought we had the title of This Strange Country, but late breaking, it has changed. But it's this little bit of a teaser because the new cover is not yet done. And when it is, I will do a cover reveal as if I were a very famous novelist. But I'm going to try to pretend I'm a very famous novelist and have a cover reveal. So I'm not going to tell you what it is.
Okay.
But alas, This Strange Country is no more, even though I have been thinking about it as This Strange Country from the very beginning. So it's going to be very hard to pivot. But that book is all about the reconstruction of the West through this exploration and preservation of Yellowstone, which happens in 71, 72, which is right smack in the middle of Reconstruction, right? This is, I think if you ask most people, you're when was Yellowstone preserved? The first thing they'll say to you is Teddy Roosevelt.
Yeah.
Which is 30 years later,
Yeah.
And it's wrong.
No, it is 1872 in the Grant administration. Like that is just like a really, and so one of the driving questions of the book project was, why now? Like they're in the thick of the KKK trials. They're like trying to deal with, still an extremely rebellious and violent white South. And they're like, oh, yeah, let's give Ferdinand Hayden $40,000 to go do a scientific exploration of Yellowstone, and then let's preserve that enormous amount of land for the good of the American people. It just seems like a very weird moment. So that was the driving question, but greater Reconstruction is definitely conceptually a part of the book project. What interests me about that term, and maybe you guys have this in your fields too, but there will be terms that people suggest that are supposed to kind of give a new frame. And as popular, as kind of respected as Elliot West is as a historian of the West, and how important that book is, that term has just never taken off.
It hasn't.
No one uses it.
I've only heard it in like literally my advisor, as well as people who have taken her class, have used that term for some. And then when I teach the second half survey, and my advisor is also teaching it, she assigns the book. That's the only time the term has been used. And I remember going to like conferences before the plague happened, and people were like, what do you mean greater Reconstruction? And I was like, first of all, I shouldn't be talking about the 19th century. I studied the late 20th century. But even if I am talking about it, how do you not know this term? You are a 19th century historian. Yeah. So it's weird. It hasn't taken off.
Yeah. I mean, one of my theories for why that is that Southern history, where the vast majority of Reconstruction studies reside, and Western history are almost completely siloed. Like almost completely. There are very few people working at the intersection. I think that's changing a little bit. We're actually going to have a combined academic conference of the Southern and the Western in Kansas City in 2024, which you can either refer to, and I refer to it both ways because they're both delightful. I either call it the Washa or the Shawa.
The Washa Shawa. I'm into it, mainly because as a water historian, the one thing that I always find fascinating is how the types of historians who study the Mississippi and like the North-South issues of water are completely different than the people who study the Western issues of water. And that's why when you're trying to understand legal history of water rights, they're two separate people. Or like literally the people are like, they're like fighting each other. It's like a civil war on its own. Yeah. And it's very weird because it confuses the history for everybody else who's trying to write a book about it. And so that's why the term really the term elated me when I first learned it, right? Because when you're reading about this idea that all of these soldiers that are attempting to reconstruct the South after 1877, after the corrupt bargain, any of the soldiers who hadn't already left, American, like Northern soldiers, they all just go to the West and start helping reconstruct the West and fighting these Indian wars. And you're like, that's fascinating.
Yeah. Well, and they were doing that even before. I mean, this
even before, yes.
Yeah. And I mean, I think it's so hard to change terms that are so sticky. Like even, I mean, borderlands, which we use all the time in academia. I taught a class on the American West in my last semester teaching at Brown as a VAP. And the best class I've ever taught, hands down, because the students were just like, they had that special chemistry, where like they just like, I didn't even speak during most of the class. They just asked each other questions. I was like, where am I? What is this? Like insane. And they were wonderful. But we read, the article about kind of positing borderlands as a term to replace frontier. And so I said, like, well, do you buy this? Like, what do you think? And all of them were like, well, we understand the argument for borderlands, but we like frontier better. And I was like, what?
They're so self-assured. I love it.
Yeah.
Oh, I know. And I think it's, Reconstruction is very sticky. Like we think of it as a predominantly Southern program. We think of it politically as very narrow. And that's very hard to get out of. And when you're thinking about textbooks and teaching high school history and like how they're chopped up into like, oh, this is the coming of the Civil War, Reconstruction. Like there's no, and then Western expansion, like that comes after, right? And so those are two separate chapters. And that's really hard to get people kind of out of that frame of reference.
Yeah. It becomes a very, No, go
I
ahead.
was just gonna say, is especially because when even if you're learning it in college, it's very hard to get out of the mindset of like, oh, okay, Polk died, the Mexican War is over. Now we're all just fighting about slavery, as if people weren't still fighting about Mexico and the West. Right? They're all fighting about everything at the same time. That's what makes it so weird. Yeah, and so that's why when anyone, so like, I have a ton of friends who are like not American historians, and they're like, Varsha, you do the easy stuff, and I'm like, excuse you, excuse you.
Yeah, I think these zombie historiography like terms, I think that they exist in every field, right? I mean, because they're such convenient shorthands, right? Like I think about this like in my own work as a medievalist, like I can put the word crusades in a course title and students are going to know what that is. They're going to sign up for it. It's going to be very easy. And then I can like problematize it afterwards. But, you know, if I really want to engage the topic, you know, and I wrote a whole article about like why we shouldn't use the word crusades, you know, but like I still find myself kind of using it because again, it's just like, it's a really easy framework for people to understand. And it's just, I don't know what happens to break that loose, you know, when everybody expects that term when you're talking about X or Y or Z or something like that. So
yeah, let's be honest, it's going to take at least like 20 to 30 years for you to be able to name a class the Bright Ages and for people to know what you're talking about.
I don't know, man. Like I'm a full professor. I can do whatever the hell I want right now. So like, it's going to happen like in the spring. So
it's going to be a field changing book. So we're going to be like, is it going to actually like reverberate? Will people pick it up and start?
Yep. We're going to have PBA, pre-Bright Ages, and ABA after Bright Ages.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. Nice.
I am all in favor of this development. I support it and I endorse it.
Thank you. You heard it here. I mean, 2 world-shattering announcements on
I know.
historians tonight.
We didn't think that was going to happen. Yeah. So. And yet it did.
Anyway, it is the second half hour, and we have some really wonderful questions from the audience, and I do want to make sure that we have time for those. You know, one of them, and I'm gonna expand it just a little bit. Mark asks about the Sand Creek Massacre specifically, and about you know, and I think this is something that every historian kind of has to confront, is we deal with horror sometimes, like terrible things that occur, and they affect people differently. Like, I mean, I recognize, like, you know, my positionality as you know, a white straight guy. So like if I write about enslaved Americans, for example, like my experience is going to be very different from somebody else's, but we still always have to do this. And so I think Mark is kind of asking, like, how do you kind of work through that in which you tell kind of an honest story about the past, while making sure that we recognize, like, this is, you know, these things are atrocities and they still need to be recognized as such.
Right. It's really hard to do that. It's really hard to tell the hard truth, right? In historical work. Yeah. And the hard truth about Sand Creek is that this is the US Army doing this. And in Civil War history and memory, you know, the Union War and the US Army is on the side of right? This is the just war. And that is in the frame of reference of the Eastern Theater, of the story of emancipation, the Emancipation Proclamation, about enslaved people, you know, running to freedom, freeing themselves behind Union lines. That story is very popular and very comforting, particularly to white Americans. And so when you're like, oh, hey, actually the US Army in the West is launching campaigns against Native people that are hard war campaigns. So they're going after women and children. They're going after older people. And as in Sand Creek, they are massacring individuals who are not on the field of battle. They are launching surprise attacks and they are killing as many people as they can. And that's really hard for a lot of people to accept, and to say, you know, the US Army was not without its faults. I mean, and it was not, I mean, there were people who protested against this. I mean, Silas Sewell, for example, was, you know, did not take part in the massacre and in fact testified against Shivington and his men in Denver, and he was murdered for it in the streets in Denver. And that, you know, so it wasn't all white soldiers in the US Army in the West who were kind of all for this and engaging in it, but many of them were. And then also Hispano soldiers in the 1st New Mexico participated in all of these campaigns against Navajos and Chiricahua Apaches and Mescalero Apaches. And this was part of a much longer history of warfare between Hispano-New Mexicans who had been Mexicans and these indigenous polities. And so they had, very different aims than the US Army, but it was all about who was going to control the West. And it's very hard, I think, I don't know if this is a particularly American thing, but I think people like things to be consistent, right? So they want, if the US Army is fighting for emancipation in the East, that's a really good thing, right? So the fact that they're simultaneously fighting for Native removal and incarceration or extermination in the West at the exact same time, and that those two goals are related, like it makes people's brains explode.
Heads explode.
Yeah. It's very hard to reconcile. And so I think as historians, I think the only way to approach it is to just say it, to just say it as plainly as possible and not to equivocate, which is a word I can't believe I have used correctly after one of these cocktails. I think you can check me on that. But yeah, you can't back off of it. You just have to be like, this is what happened, and people are fallible. And, even the people we think are really great who are fighting for right are still human beings, and they have terrible faults, and they can be both awful and wonderful at the same time.
Yeah.
There's
just
really...
because Grant, I was just saying, just because Grant liked bourbon doesn't mean he wasn't problematic.
No.
Yeah.
I think there's two really important things I just want to highlight is I love what you said about people wanting consistency. And I think we saw this recently with controversy over Grant's statues of Ulysses S. Grant, especially in the West, and people just being mystified that Native Americans would have a problem. Because they don't know, and they just think of Grant as kind of, the great liberator, the defeater of the Confederacy and of the treaties in the South and stuff like that. And then the other thing too is about, you're talking about Side of the Soul is defeating that, by telling the real story, you defeat this fallacy, this zombie trope that it was whatever that horror was a product of the time. Right. As if everybody was just on board with enslaving people or, these massacres or anything like that. Fuck no. People had problems with it then, and then we should have problems with it now because people are fucking complex. So I've said fuck several times.
They did a whole congressional investigation, not unlike the one that is going on now, of Sand Creek. It was sparked by Sand Creek. They're one of the few, there weren't that many joint select committees during this period, really only 5 or 6. And one of them was to investigate the condition. It was called Investigate the Condition of the Indian Tribes. And it was sparked by Sand Creek because they were like, this is a terrible massacre. And they called it a massacre. They didn't call it a battle. That came later, right? Yeah. So, and this is what, Ari talks about in his great book. But, they knew. They knew it was terrible. And in fact, Kit Carson, who, orchestrates and runs these hard war campaigns, especially against Mescalero Apaches and the Diné, he testifies to those guys and he says, basically white people started.
Yeah. This is just very similar to the massacre in India where I'm blanking on the name. It's the Amritsar massacre, I think. It's during British rule, and literally this British soldier, it's the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. So it's known as the Amritsar massacre, 1919. Basically, a huge peaceful crowd is gathered in this area in Amritsar, and they're protesting. They're protesting the British Empire. They're pro-Indian independence leaders. They're Indian independence leaders, and the British Army, led by this one dude who's a huge dick. Blanking on his name right now. Dyer. Colonel Dyer, I think his name is. Oh. What a name, right? General Dyer, Dyer, but his name could not have fit what his actions were better. He's just hey, all these soldiers behind me, shoot into this crowd, unarmed crowd. 1,200 people are injured. It's over 1,000 people are killed. And then the British Empire, holds a trial, or the British, Parliament, whatever, holds a trial. And they're like, yeah, Dyer, you did bad. But it's very interesting to read. I remember reading the Kelman book and thinking, wow, even people in the 19th century in Congress, white people are like pulling from a sketch comedy show from 200 years later, being like, are we the baddies here? Like, are we the bad people?
Yeah.
Absolutely. So another question, so I think that's really important is Emily, she identifies herself as an 11th grade history teacher, and she's gonna be using, she says, the Three-Cornered War in teaching. And so she wanted to take this opportunity to ask, and I think this is kind of a great kind of general questions, because we love to emphasize on this show, right, that it's historians are not just people kind of in colleges and things like that, like doing this kind of history. It's happening all over the place. But what would you want to emphasize if you were teaching like a high school level kind of history course? What would you want to emphasize from the Three-Cornered War for high school students specifically?
Oh my gosh. Well, I think the Indigenous experience is the heart of the book. And so that is a way to really get into how kind of unsettling, I can use that term also, it is to think about the war in the far West, is it brings this group of people into the history of the war that you're not really used to talking about. Even though 20,000 Indigenous men served in either the US or the Confederate armies, in all theaters, right? They were either mustered into the army, most often out of Oklahoma Territory, and pretty evenly divided in US troops and Confederate troops, but also used as scouts and spies in all different theaters of the war. And so that is something that no one ever thinks about, right? We think about this as until 1863, until the summer of 1863, a war fought by white people, Northerners and Southerners, and then Black soldiers come in to the US Army, and that kind of changes the face of things. And no one actually considers Indigenous people as being involved in this conflict at all. And so I think that, and one of the questions my editor, Kathy Belden at Scribner, asked me when I was talking to her about the book, and this is an interesting element of the process, like, you kind of have this in academic publishing, but what happens is you write a proposal, your agent goes out and sends it to a bunch of editors. And if editors are interested, they want to talk to you on the phone. And it feels like a super high stakes conversation because you're like, how can I give it? And she asked me a bunch of very interesting questions that I'd never been asked before about my writing, just because of the nature of how narrative history works. But one of the questions she asked me was, who is the heart of the story? Like, who will readers become invested in? And I think for the Three-Cornered War, that person is Juanita. She's there from the beginning until the very end of the book. The only other person who is there with her consistently is John Clark, who is the surveyor of New Mexico Territory, who's like an interesting dude in his own right, friend of Lincoln, lawyer, but very interested in mapping and selling the Southwest and undermining Native people. So his story and Juanita's story kind of work together in a really interesting way. But I think if I were teaching Three-Cornered War to high school students, and I'm super happy to come and zoom into your class, by the way. Now that we all know how to do that, it's actually way easier now, which is a weird pandemic silver lining. It's actually possible for me to come in and talk to students where I wouldn't normally be able to do that. So if you want me to zoom in and talk to them about their questions about the war in this theater, about writing or anything, let me know. Just contact me through my website, name check Drinking with Historians. It'll all be good. I promise I'll remember, even though now I'm on my second.
She will remember. I'll remind her.
Yeah, Varsha will remind me. I'll be like, what happened in the last 15 minutes? And you'll be like,
it's all being recorded, Megan. It's all being recorded. So it's
that's true. I'll be like, what did I promise people in that last I feel like maybe some things happened. Some shit went down. But I think that is the kind of most, if you're going to talk about kind of interventions in particular books, I think that is the one that I was most interested in making, was sort of saying the Civil War is an Indian war. And this is how we see it in the Southwest. So sort of building on Ari's argument.
there's a really good combination of questions that I want to ask. So Richard asked, during this congressional investigation that happened, a couple of years after the Sand Creek Massacre, were there Native American voices heard at this congressional investigation? And what Native sources do you have for the Sand Creek Massacre that, you were able to look at? And building on that, somebody asked a while ago about, you're calling it the three-cornered war. Are the different, groups that you're looking at, the Navajo, the Apache, the Chiricahua, are they all allied against each other, are they all allied with each other against, Northern white Americans, or are they all separate? Is it really a 5-cornered war or 10-cornered? Who knows?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's actually like a 7 or 8-cornered war. But that was going to get a little too complicated. Like that was going to be a little too
trade publishers would not like the 7 or 8 or I don't know 9-cornered war.
Yeah. The N-cornered war, the N to the N plus 1 cornered war.
That's right. Insert number here. That they would not have, the title gods would not have liked that one at all. But yes, the investigative committee came to Bosque Redondo, which is the reservation that U.S. Army officials forced the Diné and also Mescalero Apaches onto between 1864 and 1866. And they came in 1865 to investigate the conditions. The conditions there were already terrible, and for multiple reasons. One of which was James Carleton, who was a general from California who had marched 2,000 of his men across the desert in spring and summer of 1862 to get from Los Angeles to the Rio Grande. He took over the Department of New Mexico, and he was really the brains behind all of these campaigns against Native peoples. And he had chosen the site of Bosque Redondo, which was about 40 square miles on the Pecos River in central New Mexico, 400 miles away from the Diné homeland, and about 100 miles away from the Mescalero Apache homeland. It was a terrible site. The water in the river was awful. They, couldn't really grow crops there without really good irrigation, and that part of the river was not good for that. I mean, it was a complete disaster, and this created a human rights disaster where 25% of Navajos and Mescalero Apaches died between 1864 and 1868, which puts it right up there with like Andersonville and other prisoner of war camps. And the US Army really thought of them as their prisoners in this context and used that term, prisoners. So this was a reservation, but it was also a prisoner of war camp. But they did interview chiefs of both the Mescaleros and then also of the Diné, and asked them kind of what their experience had been. And I mean, it is amazing. And this is what I think is really interesting about mid-19th century politicians, is that when they did these investigations, like they transcribed that stuff. Like the clerks are just like, they like wrote everything down and they published it. So this testimony completely is corroborated by all of this other evidence, and their voices do make it into print. Sand Creek does not enter into the narrative in Three Cornered War as much because that took place in southern Colorado territory, and I was more interested in New Mexico and Arizona. So it is part and parcel of a larger kind of U.S. stance toward Native people during this period. It's exactly at the same moment that U.S. Army officials are forcing Navajos to Bosque Redondo. They're also engaged in a big fight with Kiowa and Comanche warriors a little bit further east, and Kit Carson is in command of that campaign too. So it's happening all kind of at the same moment. But I was super lucky for the chapters on Juanita and the chapters on particularly Navajo history to have sources written by Navajo historians, by Jennifer Nez Dinetdale and Ruth Rossell, who wrote amazing histories of Juanita and her husband Manuelito, who was a very powerful headman, and also women in Navajo society. And I was really mindful of really kind of putting those voices, not only of Juanita and of Navajo civilians during this period, kind of bringing them to the fore, but also using Navajo produced sources. So oral histories of the Long Walk and Bosque Redondo, and then also the work of these amazing historians. And the fact that they published those histories that I could, as a non-native historian, that I could use was incredibly important to the project.
There's a really good question from Chris. He sort of asked, building on this teaching question, right? If the West, specifically the American West, whatever that is, because that is defined differently depending on who you're talking to, if it's incorporated better into America's popular understandings, or even in American schools in K through 12 or in college, what do you think would be the most changed in how Americans understand their history? Like, how does understanding the American West change our understanding of American history? Maybe even just the American Southwest.
I know. That's an excellent question. And that's a question that editors ask. They're like, why do I want to read this book about the American West? Like, why do I care? Like, why do I care about this place at all? One of the reasons I think it's important is that to see kind of the nation evolving more holistically. That this is not just a nation built by Puritans in the Northeast or slaveholders in the Southeast.
It's not all about Boston, people.
No,
there are people who are just like,
it's all about Boston and freaking Charleston. I'm sorry, but it's not. Or Richmond, like there are people are moving. This is the thing that astonishes me the more I kind of read about US history and encounter it. People are moving in every direction constantly throughout the 19th century. And the current kind of narrative that we have is this very east to west like just a propulsive motion, like this is Western expansion and conquest. Yeah. But if you start to look at those processes from the West, you start to see a much more diverse, much more contested kind of US history. That these are stories we're telling, right? There's the whole kind of pioneer myth and this whole idea that like the essential Americans, as Turner would have it, are kind of moving with the frontier and engaging with struggle, and that's the American character. And when you actually start to focus more on Western history, you realize that that's not actually what's happening. Like the American character is being formed by multiple groups of people coming from all different places and moving through the country, like through the West, but then also through the country kind of in its entirety throughout the century. And so throughout the 19th century. I'm a little biased. I'm sorry, Varsha. I'm like the 20th, I don't even know. Like I was reading for a book prize committee.
Hello from the 11th. So,
I know.
Whatever.
But then I was reading 20th books about the 20th century, and I was like, these are so fascinating, but I have no idea what's going on. The 19th century, I'm like, yes, this is where it's at.
At least when I read the 19th century, I know what's happening. When I get anywhere before 1787, I'm like, I have completely lost. Just completely lost.
Matt, this is why your work is important.
Yeah. This is like vast, modern. This is like sci-fi. From my perspective.
You know nothing. Everything after 15 whatever is modern history, Varsha.
That's right.
It's all the same.
I don't know, like 1300 actually, like more. Yeah. So.
Yeah. We have time for one last question, Matt?
Sure. Yeah. Why not? Let's do one more question.
So you write a lot about Native Americans. When we are in school, at least when I moved to like a bunch of different schools. I moved from schools from Madison, Wisconsin to Ohio to California. So I learned a lot about Native Americans in elementary school. But there were a lot of like misrepresentations. What is your most beloved Native American popular culture representation that you used to like to teach with? Or what's your most hated? Either one. Like movie, book, whatever.
Oh. I mean, Dances with Wolves, right? I mean, that is like, especially for Civil War historians, because the beginning of that movie is a Civil War movie.
Yeah.
Like, and so here is a US soldier who somehow, he goes west because he's injured and ailing, right? So he's like seeking redemption, like in the West.
Yep.
And he finds it through Native like relationships and culture. And it's such a white savior narrative. And I mean, there are some important things in that movie, and the fact that they, you know, they used indigenous language, there were indigenous actors, like that was important. But that is actually, Dances with Wolves is a pretty good teaching text. I mean, I haven't actually taught it, but I would imagine it would be a good teaching text because it has all of those components to it. And I think students now would be like, come on now. Like,
exactly.
We've got Rutherford Falls, we've got Yellowstone, which is actually that I couldn't even, the pilot of that television show, I was like, have either of you watched this?
No.
Nope.
The Kevin Costner, obviously, show, and it's got like 3 seasons. I think it's on its 3rd season, maybe. And hilariously, highly recommended by lots of white suburban ladies. Mostly because the like cowboys are super hot. Like we were talking about, you know. But that show, I mean, I swear it hit on every single major topic in like right now, like hot topics in US Western history. Like there is the land back movement, there's indigenous rights, there's the environmental like destruction of cattle ranching, there's the impact of development and like class stratification and tourism in the West. I mean, I watched the pilot and I was like, I just have to like go away and process. Like there were like daddy issues and like all sorts of other stuff that you would totally like appreciate just from a viewing standpoint of any kind of popular culture. But if I were teaching now and I were teaching a US West course, I think Yellowstone would be an amazing, like seriously, like I mean, crazy shit goes down, there are murders. I mean, it's just ridiculous. But the underlying tensions, especially between like all of the different communities in the US West, including indigenous communities. And I should go back. I mean, someone asked about, you know, I don't think you ever want to sort of bring all indigenous polities into a Native America. Like all of them are very, very different. And in fact, what I've been talking to what I've been saying when I've been talking to public audiences about the Three-Cornered War is that like, we need more studies of like basically every single indigenous nation and their experience of the Civil War. Some of them had like really no contact. Some of them had very intensive contact. And in fact, you know, Navajo and Chiricahua Apache histories have very intensive contact. So Three-Cornered War can maybe give you a little bit of a skewed idea that like indigenous polities were like super, super kind of engaged in Civil War politics and Civil War military action. And that's not the case throughout the entire nation, really. And so what we need is more work on all of those communities because they're all completely different and all individual in their own right.
Yeah, important to split those groups apart and not think of them as single polities. So unfortunately, I think we're just about out of time. What? I do want to
How dare you?
I know. Dare you? This is terrible. This is the worst part of drinking with historians.
I'm gonna keep drinking.
You should keep drinking. It's Friday evening. I mean, you know, we're all friends here. So before we go though, I did want to very briefly, have you guys ever seen the show? It's on Peacock TV called Rutherford Falls. You heard of it at all?
I was going to watch it. It's on my watch list.
It is a very good show. It's really interesting because it talks about kind of statues and monuments and Native American history and stuff. It has a fully Indigenous American writing room, and so like it has a really great thing. There's an amazing scene which you both would absolutely love in the second to last episode, in which one character explains the 7 things that all Americans know about American history, and it involves butter churns, and it's the funniest thing I've ever seen in my entire life.
Yeah! Okay,
so
no,
I want to use that as a framework for some episode, like maybe Varsha, if we ever do a live episode or something like that. We need to,
definitely.
Use that, so.
Yeah.
But anyway, so go out and watch Rutherford Falls because it's a really wonderful show.
Yeah.
But anyway, thank you so much, Megan, for joining us. This has been an exceptional hour. It's gone incredibly quickly. Please, everybody, just feel free to keep drinking, even if the Zoom is off, as all Friday. Please join us next week. Next week, we're going to have Professor Cord Whitaker from Wellesley College. We're going to be talking. I won't be here, unfortunately, but he will represent the medieval. We'll be talking about super hot Dev Patel in the movie The Green Knight and medieval literature. Yes, and I think
so. Everybody, go watch The Green Knight this week. I'm gonna go watch it tomorrow or tonight. So everybody,
or read the poem too. You could read the 14th century Middle English poem if you want. But
sure. That's on my to read list. Yeah.
Yeah, that's another thing too.
But does it have hot Dev Patel in the poem?
It has hot Gowan, but it's not hot Dev Patel. It is a different thing. So I have to say that. So. Anyway, so I think Rachel will actually be joining Varsha to talk to Cord. Maybe you can ask Cord and Rachel about how they went to high school together. Like, I don't know, like, I'm not going to be here.
Yeah.
You could actually do that. So maybe there's some saucy details that will come out along the way. Anyway, thank you so much, Megan. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Until next week, let me simply say cheers.
Cheers. Thanks so much, Megan.